We've had a good introduction to our commencement speaker this year, both in your program and in the citation as he received his honorary doctorate in canon law. One thing was not included in all of that data and information. He's also a bluegrass banjo player. So I introduced to you a bluegrass banjo player for your commencement speaker this year, Dr. Robert George.
Your Beatitude, Excellencies, Reverend Fathers and Deacons, Reverend Mothers and Sisters, Doctors, Masters, Trustees, ladies and gentlemen, Christ is risen. I am deeply honored by the invitation to give the commencement address at St. Vladimir's Seminary, which has done and will continue to do so much good in the world for the body of Christ and for all men and women. I want to begin by congratulating those who will be receiving degrees and other honors today. May God bless the work that you do. May God bless your ministries, and may you not suffer too much theology. I want to thank and congratulate my beloved friend, Father Chad, for all that he has done for the body of Christ, especially in his work here at St. Vladimir's. Father Chad and I have worked together on a number of projects, and it has always been a pure joy, and one from which I have always learned from Father Chad, a great priest, a great man, a great Christian. And what a joy to be here receiving an honorary doctorate with my beloved and longtime friend, Father Pat Reardon. More than a friend. We all need heroes. We all need people who inspire us. And Father Pat is way up on the list of my heroes and way up on the list of the people who have inspired me. Many, many, many more years to you, Father Pat, and congratulations on the honor you're receiving today. The great 20th century Jewish public intellectual and man of letters, Milton Himmelfarb, famously defied those of his co-religionists who claim that Judaism cannot be defined. His definition was via negativa. He said, Judaism is against paganism. That's it. This approach to understanding biblical faith is anything but flippant, for at its foundation, at its very heart, is the most unpagan, indeed anti-pagan of all ideas, namely, that man, though made from the mere dust of the earth, is fashioned in the very image and likeness of God. Now, what could such a teaching mean? In other words, how are we mere mortal, material human beings God-like? It cannot mean that God has 5 fingers on each of 2 hands and hair on his head and a nose. God is immaterial. Rather, it means this, that we human beings, albeit mortal and material, possess the literally, we can use this word for once correctly, literally awesome, God-like powers of reason and freedom. Like God, as he is presented to us in the book of Genesis, we are able to envisage states of affairs that do not exist, grasp the value, the intelligible point of bringing those states of affairs into being, and then act freely based on our rational grasp of the intelligible point of bringing them into existence, and not merely on impulse or instinct like a brute animal to bring them about. And in so acting freely and on reasons, we do more than merely alter states of affairs in the world external to us. No, we also shape our own characters. Our agency makes us morally self-constituting creatures, responsible for acting virtuously, even when doing so requires our resisting powerful feelings or emotions, tempting us to do otherwise, doing so even when we suffer. So again, unlike brute animals, we are creatures who are capable of self-transcendence, self-mastery. Now, if the biblical teaching that each and every member of the human family, no matter how small, no matter how weak, no matter how vulnerable, poor, disabled, despised, is the bearer of profound, inherent, and equal dignity, if that's true, then the respect called forth by that dignity demands something that is alien to paganism, as alien as it could possibly be, and that is a genuine reverence for human beings, for human life. It requires us to abjure practices that paganism valorizes and even glorifies, from unchastity to abortion and infanticide to slavery, conquest, and domination. And it requires us to abjure these practices even when our own circumstances, desires, and self-interest tempt us to embrace and try to rationalize them. Now, the greatest thinkers of pagan antiquity grasped, or partially grasped, moral truths that put them in some ways in adversarial postures toward accepted practices of their times and places, including forms of unchastity and homicide. But none, even the greatest, fully grasped the moral implications of the principle of the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. Indeed, Christians and others who affirm the principle as a matter not only of reason but of divine revelation often fail to grasp its full implications. Paganism is perennially an internal and not merely external challenge to the Christian faith. Perennially. Always has been. Always will be until Jesus comes again in glory. Christians are constantly falling back into pagan ideologies and practices. Today, entire denominations have declared themselves in support of neo-pagan practices of various sorts that are explicitly in conflict with the biblical witness. But for anyone who truly grasps the principle and has some conception of its full moral implications, the question naturally arises, how shall we order our lives together? How shall we conceive and pursue the common good in ways that are consistent with the dignity of the human person as a creature fashioned in the very image and likeness of God? Now, it was the distinctive claim of late 20th century secular political philosophy that sound principles of justice require that law and government be neutral as between controversial conceptions of the human good. Those of you who've studied a bit of political philosophy will recognize that as the basic stance of the most influential of all the 20th century secular liberal political philosophers, the great Harvard scholar John Rawls. Now, critics of that view, including me, argued that the neutrality, or so-called neutrality, to which the orthodox secularist political theory of that period aspired, or at least purported to aspire, was neither desirable nor, strictly speaking, possible. That political philosophy was, we argued, built on premises into which had been smuggled controversial substantive ideas, secularist ideas about human nature, the human good, human dignity, and indeed human destiny. Ideas as substantive and controversial and controverted as those proposed by Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or any other so-called comprehensive view, whether secular or religious. Now, today, we fast forward to 2024, little effort is made by secular political philosophers to maintain the pretense of neutrality, having gained the advantage and in many cases having prevailed, at least for now, on battlefront after battlefront in the modern culture war, and having achieved hegemony in elite sectors of the culture, for example, in education at every level, in the news and entertainment media, in the professions, in corporate America, and even in much of religion. There is no longer any need to pretend. Take as an example the issue of marriage. Today, virtually no one on either side doubts that marriage, as redefined by the Supreme Court, embodies substantive ideas about morality and the human good, ideas that differ profoundly from those embodied in previous marriage law. Ideas that, according to partisans of the redefinition of marriage, are to be preferred to competing ideas, such as biblical and natural law understandings of marriage, precisely because they are allegedly superior to the ideas they supplanted. So now that the pretense of neutrality has been more or less abandoned and is on its way to being forgotten, what is the substance of the perspective or ideology? What some may, without doing too much violence to the word, even call a religion or pseudo-religion. What is the new view that is now fully exposed to view, and not merely to the view of its critics? Professor Stephen Smith, in a valuable book, and Louise Perry, contemporary public commentator in an important recent essay, say that it is a revised and revitalized and modernized, up-to-date paganism. And I think they're right. Now, this label is, of course, provocative. Professor Smith's and Miss Perry's reasons for choosing it, however, go well beyond any mere desire to provoke. What they perceive, rightly in my view, is that contemporary ideas reflect certain core and constitutive beliefs that partially defined the traditions of paganism that were dominant in the ancient Mediterranean world and in certain other places, up to the point at which they were defeated, though never quite destroyed, by Christianity. Now, of course, some secularists will suppose that people like me or Louise Perry or Stephen Smith are deploying the term pagan as an epithet. But we mean something quite specific by the word. We use it to characterize ideas and beliefs that a great many people today, especially those in the ideological vanguard, have in common with people of, for example, pre-Christian Rome. Now, this does not mean that contemporary secularists share all the ideas and beliefs of the ancient Romans, such as beliefs in gods like Jupiter and Neptune and Venus, but rather that some of the central ideas and beliefs that distinguish secular ideologies from Orthodox, small o as well as large o, Christians and Jews today, are ideas and beliefs they have common with the people whose ideas and beliefs Judaism and Christianity challenged in the ancient world. Secularists, no less than people of other faiths, hold cherished, even identity-forming beliefs about what is ultimately meaningful, important, valuable, good or bad, right or wrong, just or unjust. They may not believe in God or a transcendent and personal deity, but certain things are nevertheless sacred to them, things they live for and we'd be prepared to fight for and even die for. For example, what they regard as racial justice or LGBT rights or environmental responsibility and so forth. They have faith and a faith. Professor Smith explains that although not theistic, or in any literal sense polytheistic, there's nevertheless a core in which contemporary ideologies do mimic pagan religion. Professor Smith explains, pagan religion locates the sacred within this world. In that way, paganism can consecrate the world from within. It is religiosity relative to an immanent sacred. Judaism and Christianity, by contrast, reflect transcendent religiosity. They place the sacred ultimately outside the world, unquote. Now, Professor Smith concedes that this characterization oversimplifies things a bit. But the oversimplification is mainly in the description and characterization of Judaism and Christianity, not progressivism, contemporary progressivism. The biblical faiths conceive God as transcendent, to be sure, but not in a way that excludes elements of divine immanence. In Christian doctrine, a transcendent God sanctifies the world of human affairs by entering into it, quite literally in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, while still transcending it. And God's transcendence means that for the believer, this world is not one's ultimate home. We're, in a sense, resident aliens. And so Smith contrasts Jews and Christians with pagans on precisely this point. Quote, the pagan orientation accepts the world as our home and does so joyously, exuberantly, and worshipfully, unquote. Now, Christianity, had it been a religion of pure and exclusive transcendence, might have simply rejected this world and not concerned itself with this world's affairs. The authorities of pagan Rome might then have left it alone, treating it as just one more odd and exotic religion in an ancient world conquered by Rome that was filled with odd and exotic religions, most of which the Roman authorities were perfectly willing to tolerate. But Christianity did take an interest in the world's affairs and developed ideas about such things as authority, obligation, law, justice, and the common good, ideas that challenged pagan ideas and practices in a variety of areas, some of them profoundly important. And one such area, a central area, was that of sex and sexuality. As Smith notes, within the pagan matrix of assumptions, and I quote, the Christian view of sexuality was not only radically alien, it was close to incomprehensible, unquote. Now, this is certainly true historically, but consider that the Christian view of sexuality is today, within the matrix of assumptions of contemporary secularism, also perfectly aptly described as not only radically alien, but close to incomprehensible. Consider again the debate over marriage, just one of many possible examples. The biblical and natural law conception of marriage as conjugal, that is, the one flesh union of sexually complementary spouses, is not only alien to contemporary secular ideology. Those who understand marriage in this way make themselves virtually incomprehensible to those who have substituted for that old vision an understanding of marriage as essentially sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership. Or consider the view that non-marital sexual conduct and relationships are inherently immoral. That too, that central Christian view, is regarded by a great many people today not only as unsound, but as unreasonable, outrageous, scandalous, bigoted, hateful. They can account for it, if at all, only as religious irrationalism, bigotry, or as many today now claim, a psychopathology. There's something wrong with you. Got something wrong in the head if you cling to that old idea that sex belongs in and only in marriage. As the historian Kyle Harper notes, sexuality came to mark the divide, quote, between the Christians and the world. Christian ideas rooted in Jewish thought about sexual norms, including fornication, adultery, even by men. In the ancient world, adultery by women was considered a very bad thing. By men, not so much. Homosexual acts, pornographic displays, and so forth were revolutionary. And the pagan establishment was no more welcoming of revolutionaries, even nonviolent ones like the Christians, than any other establishment is welcoming of revolutionaries. It's the thing about establishments, they're not especially welcoming of revolutionaries. It was not that the Roman authorities refused to allow minority religions in the empire. As I said earlier, those that could coexist with the dominant religion were allowed to do just that. The Romans were actually, in many ways, quite tolerant of weird, exotic practices from their perspective. But the Romans always found the Jews to be troublesome, and they perceived Christianity, a convert-seeking religion, when it came along, as a grave threat, despite the fact that the Christians were not armed insurrectionists. And Christian ideas about sex, and in particular about Roman sexual practices, figured significantly in that perception. They feared that Christianity would, in Stephen Smith's evocative phrase, and I quote him again, turn the lights out on the party. And that's, of course, exactly what Christianity eventually did. But in our own time, the lights have been turned back on and the party is going again. In the 1940s, Alfred Kinsey convinced a lot of people that sexual satisfaction is a human need. that psychological health and wholeness generally require frequent, regular sexual activity, which may or may not be inside marriage, and that Judeo-Christian norms of sexual morality, when embraced, result in stilted, even twisted personalities and just do a lot of harm. In the 1950s, Hugh Hefner persuaded people that pornography, so-called softcore pornography of his Playboy magazine, could be, indeed was, just innocent fun, and that the Playboy philosophy of sexual indulgence was the way to go for up-to-date, sophisticated people. The gay rights movement has made the affirmation of homosexual conducts and relationships the civil rights cause of our day, as they say. Dissent is not permitted. Claims to religious freedom are dismissed as mere excuses for discrimination. That's what happens to the cake baker, the wedding planner, and so forth. Observant Christians and other traditional religious believers have been knocked back on their heels. Reversing the sexual revolution, despite the growing evidence showcased by Louise Perry, among others, Louise Perry herself being a secular person, of its baleful social consequences, especially for children, seems nearly inconceivable. Few believe that its forward march can be paused or even meaningfully slowed down. The vast majority of religious believers think that the most they can hope for in this new epoch of pagan ascendancy are some protections for their own liberty to lead their lives and bring up their families as they see fit, that is, in conformity with their religious faith, and at least not be forced to facilitate or participate in activities that they cannot in good conscience condone. Secularists say, after all, that they are all for individual autonomy and liberty. In pushing the redefinition of marriage, they insisted that all they were seeking was live and let live. Now, of course, that claim has already proven to be disingenuous. Many religious people despair of even the possibility of protecting their own children from being indoctrinated into the beliefs of the governing elite, the new ruling class, or what perhaps might better be described as the old but repaganized ruling class. Yesterday, at their request, I met with a group of Chinese American parents in the lounge near my office at Princeton, parents of students in public school in Princeton. And the parents were there to meet me and talk with me and seek some advice because they were absolutely in shock, scandalized by what their children were being forced to endure, being exposed to in family education classes, so-called health education classes in the Princeton public schools. These men and women could not believe what their children were bringing home by way of the materials in the course. So many people believe, and I don't think they're wrong, that we've entered a sort of new Diocletian age. They not unreasonably suppose that it is precisely this reality that is being signaled when progressive intellectuals, such as my colleague Mark Tushnet of the Harvard Law School, say things like this, and let me quote Professor Tushnet, a very prominent and mainstream liberal law professor. Quote, "The culture war is over. They lost, we won. Taking a hard line is better than trying to accommodate the losers who, remember, defended and are defending positions that liberals regard as having no normative pull at all. Trying to be nice to the losers didn't work well after the Civil War, nor after Brown against Board of Education. And taking a hard line seemed to work reasonably well in Germany and Japan after 1945. I should note that LGBT activists in particular seem to have settled on the hard line approach." This is still Professor Tushnet continuing, "while some liberal academics defend more accommodating approaches. When specific battles in the culture war were being fought, it might have made sense to try to be accommodating after a local victory because other related fights were going on, and a hard line might have stiffened the opposition in those fights. But the war is over and we won." Well, there you are. They're in no mood to be accommodating. Dissenters from the dogmas of secularism can expect the hardline approach. We Christians are to be treated like the defeated Germans and Japanese after World War II. You don't have to take my word for it. Professor Tushnet will tell you. For faithful religious folk who dissent from this new orthodoxy, the question then, of course, is what is to be done? How should we respond to the hard line approach? Well, some religious folk have already taken the path of acquiescence. They maintain visible forms of faith while yielding to its moral substance. For example, simply letting your children be exposed in public schools to whatever's being taught there, look the other way. But I don't think that's an option for serious believers. So what do? Well, often the question is posed as fight or flight. Rod Dreher has coined the phrase the Benedict option. She's described as a strategic retreat, but he also says that it doesn't mean that we should not stay involved in the world. Well, I certainly agree that we need to stay involved in the world. We have an obligation as believers to bear faithful witness to the values and principles we know are integral to justice and human flourishing. But I don't see what we should be retreating from, even strategically. And to what or where could we retreat? To our families, our religious communities, civil society associations? That won't work. They'll hunt us down and dismantle our institutions. They're determined that our children, or at least our grandchildren, will think the way they think, not the way we think. So permitting us to retreat to the functional equivalent of the monasteries, where we can quietly tend the gardens of our own families and transmit to our children our own values, is not an option for them. Again, remember that we're to be treated like the defeated Japanese and Germans after World War II. So flight really is not an option. We have no choice but to fight. And in this era, our fight is not simply to uphold values pertaining to such matters as marriage and the sanctity of human life. It is, at least here in the United States, to protect basic principles of Republican civic life that people once claimed to champion and even to have discovered, but are now prepared to cast aside and even trample. Principles such as freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right of peaceful assembly, limited government, democratic participation, the rule of law. This fight will not be easy. On the contrary, it is and will continue to be hard. There will be casualties, lots of them. People will be canceled. They'll be denied educational opportunities and opportunities for professional advancement when people find out you really believe what the Christian faith or what the Bible teaches. Some will lose their jobs. That's already happened in academia and well beyond academia. Many will be ridiculed, shamed, defamed, vilified. The cost of true discipleship is what it's always been, high, a heavy cost. And I think it's going to get heavier. We followers of Jesus are back in the position of our forebears in imperial Rome. If we're true to our faith, if we're true to ourselves, then we are quite literally intolerable, at least as far as the Mark Tushnets of the world are concerned. And they are legion, and they hold massive cultural, political, and economic power. So the question we face is simply this: can we muster the courage to be faithful, to boldly bear witness to truths that are unpopular among those controlling the levers of cultural and economic power? Are we willing, if necessary, to pay the costs, the heavy costs of discipleship? Of course, without God's help, nothing of this kind would be possible. Yet we have it on good authority, the best authority, that God's grace is superabundant. No one who asks for the courage to bear faithful witness will be denied it. So shall we flee from the battle? No, quite the opposite. Onward, Christian soldiers. Thank you and congratulations again for the graduating class.